Tier 1. The Rack. The rack was a wooden frame with rollers at each end connected to ropes tied to a victim's wrists and ankles. The torturer would turn a handle that slowly pulled the ropes, stretching the person's body. First came pain, then dislocating shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows. In extreme cases, limbs could be completely torn from the body. Popular in medieval Europe, especially during the Inquisition, the rack was kept in castle dungeons and towers. Victims would scream so loudly that some torture chambers had soundproofing. The rack's effectiveness came from the fact that the pain could be gradually increased, giving the victim time to confess or provide information. The torturer could stop at any point, making it a favorite tool for extracting confessions. Most victims who survived suffered permanent physical damage, with joints that never properly healed and chronic pain for life. The rack remained in use for centuries, with variations appearing across Europe. In England, it was known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, after its supposed inventor. Yeah, I wouldn't last a second with that. As soon as they reached for the lever, I'm talking. But as brutal as that was, it was only the beginning. Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden was a human-sized metal cabinet designed to look like a woman. The inside was filled with iron spikes positioned to pierce non-lethal parts of the body when the doors closed. This meant victims would bleed and suffer extreme pain without dying quickly. You've got to wonder what kind of mindset it takes to invent something like that. A coffin with spikes? Despite its infamous reputation, historical evidence suggests the Iron Maiden was more myth than reality. While spike-lined devices existed, the elaborate coffin-like structure was likely exaggerated by Victorian-era writers fascinated with medieval torture. Museums often displayed replicas built centuries after the Middle Ages. Stories claim victims would be sealed inside for hours or days, with the spikes causing slow, painful death from blood loss and infection. The psychological terror of being sealed inside a dark, spiked coffin was part of the torture. And that was just one method. The next one pushes the limit even more. Thumb screws. Thumb screws were simple but horrifically effective devices consisting of two metal plates connected by screws. The victim's thumbs, fingers, or toes would be placed between the plates, which were slowly tightened by turning the screws. As pressure increased, the victim felt extreme pain, then crushing of tissue, and finally, breaking of bones. What made thumb screws particularly effective was their portable size and the fact that hands contained many nerve endings, making the pain unbearable. Torturers often showed the device to victims before using it, as the sight alone could prompt confessions. Popular throughout Europe from the 1500s to 1700s, variations existed for different parts including knee screws and leg screws for larger joints. Being forced to watch your own bones get crushed? That's horrifying. The damage could permanently disable victims, destroying their ability to use their hands, particularly devastating for craftspeople, writers, or anyone who relied on manual dexterity for their livelihood. As bad as that was, it gets worse. Waterboarding. Waterboarding involves restraining a person on their back at an incline with their head lower than their feet. Their face is covered with cloth and water is poured over their face, creating a drowning sensation. The cloth makes it difficult to breathe and water enters the nose and mouth. The body instinctively fights against drowning, triggering panic and terror. What makes waterboarding particularly effective is that it leaves no visible marks while creating genuine fear of death. The victim can be revived quickly and subjected to repeated sessions. Dating back hundreds of years, waterboarding gained modern attention for its use during the War on Terror. Unlike older torture methods, it's designed to create psychological trauma rather than physical trauma, though it can cause lung damage, brain damage from oxygen deprivation, and psychological conditions including PTSD. Public flogging. Public flogging used whips, canes, or rods to strike victims tied to posts or frames in town squares or other public spaces. Different tools cause different types of injury. Leather whips cut the skin, while canes bruise deeper tissue. Beyond physical pain, the public nature added humiliation and social punishment. Victims were often stripped partially or completely, and communities were sometimes required to attend, making the punishment as much about shame as physical suffering. Throughout history, flogging has been used against slaves, criminals, military deserters, and political dissidents. The number of lashes would correspond to the severity of the crime, with some sentences delivering enough blows to be fatal. Despite being banned in many countries, public flogging continues in some parts of the world today as an official punishment under certain legal systems. From physical pain to psychological torment, we're only scratching the surface right now. It's time to take it a step deeper. Tier 2. Chinese water torture. Chinese water torture isn't about causing instant pain but breaking someone mentally. The victim is strapped down flat so they can't move their head. Then, Cold water dripped slowly onto their forehead, one drop at a time, always landing in the exact same spot. Nothing happens at first except mild irritation, but after hours, that single spot on the skin becomes hypersensitive. Each drop feels heavier, more intense. The victim can't predict exactly when the next drop will fall, but knows it's coming. This creates a building anxiety that gets worse with each drip. What makes it truly torturous is the combination of restraint, repetition, and unpredictability. The victim has no control, can't escape, and can't even move their head to avoid the drops. Sleep becomes impossible. After days of this treatment, the constant dripping can drive people to hallucinations and complete mental breakdown. The skin where the water hits becomes raw and irritated, adding physical pain to the psychological torture. Honestly, this one scares me more than the bloody stuff. Despite its name, historians debate whether this method actually originated in China. It gained popularity in Western imagination through movies and fiction, becoming a symbol of how torture doesn't need to be physically brutal to be effective. The real horror lies in its simplicity. Just water and time are enough to break the human mind. If you thought that was twisted, wait till you hear this next one. Scaphism. Scaphism might be the most disgusting torture method ever devised. Used by ancient Persians, it started by forcing the victim to consume excessive amounts of milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. Then they were stripped naked and fastened between two hollowed-out boats, or sometimes logs, with only their head, hands, and feet sticking out. The executioner would then smear more honey on exposed parts, particularly the face, genitals, and feet, before leaving the victim floating in a stagnant pond or swamp. The honey attracted insects that would begin feeding on the victim and laying eggs in their flesh. The boat prevented the person from drowning, while the honey and milk mixture caused constant diarrhea, creating a festering environment inside the boat. Insects would burrow into the victim's flesh, and larvae would hatch and begin consuming them from the inside out. Victims couldn't shoo away insects or scratch their bites. They were force-fed more milk and honey daily to keep them alive and ensure continued diarrhea. Death came excruciatingly slowly, sometimes taking weeks, from a combination of dehydration, starvation, and being eaten alive by insects and their larvae. What made scaphism particularly terrible was its duration and the victim's complete awareness throughout most of the process. The method was reserved for the worst criminals in Persian society, including traitors and murderers of royalty. What comes next is even more unsettling. The Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle was a pyramid-shaped wooden device with the point facing upward. The victim would be placed above it with the tip at their butt or genitalia, then slowly lowered down. Their legs would be tied together or to weights to prevent them from supporting their weight and avoiding penetration. Some things you just don't want to visualize. Cradles used to mean comfort, not horror. What made this torture particularly cruel was its slow nature. The victim wasn't dropped onto the device. They were lowered gradually, often over many hours. The tip would slowly penetrate them, causing tearing and excruciating pain. As their leg muscles tired, they'd sink further onto the point. Torturers could adjust the victim's position or add weights to control how quickly they descended. Some versions included rocking the victim, causing further internal damage. The device wasn't meant to kill quickly. Victims might be left on it for hours or even days, suffering from internal bleeding and perforation. The name Judas Cradle references Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus, suggesting this torture was often used against traitors. The psychological component was significant. Victims could see what was happening to them and knew their suffering would only worsen as their strength gave out. Used throughout medieval Europe, particularly during the Spanish Inquisition, survivors suffered permanent damage to their rectal or genital tissues. Infection was common in those who survived, often leading to death days later, even if they had successfully endured the torture itself. If that caught you off guard, the next part will be even more intense. Necklacing. Necklacing is a form of execution that became notorious during South Africa's apartheid era in the 1980s and 1990s. The method was brutally simple. A rubber tire is forced around the victim's chest and arms, pinning their arms to their body. The tire is then filled with gasoline and set on fire. The burning rubber sticks to the skin and can't be removed. The victim dies from burns, shock, and smoke inhalation. Death isn't instant. It typically takes anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. The rubber releases toxic chemicals as it burns, making the smoke itself deadly to breathe. Victims remain conscious through much of their suffering. What makes necklacing particularly horrific is its public nature. It was typically performed in front of crowds as a warning to others. The practice was most commonly used against people accused of being police informants or collaborating with the apartheid government. Though most associated with South Africa, similar methods have been used in parts of Latin America, Haiti, and other regions experiencing civil conflict. In some cases, the practice has been revived during periods of civil unrest or vigilante justice. The psychological impact goes beyond the victim. The public spectacle creates lasting trauma in communities where it occurs. The smell of burning rubber and flesh lingers in the area for days afterward, serving as a constant reminder of the violence. Despite its relatively recent origin compared to historical torture methods, necklacing has been one of the most feared forms of execution. It's grim stuff, but important to talk about. If you found it informative, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. Bastinado. Bastinado focuses on one of the most sensitive parts of the body, the soles of the feet. The victim is restrained with their bare feet exposed, usually elevated to make them accessible. The torturer then beats the soles with a rod, cane, or whip, delivering dozens or even hundreds of blows. What makes this torture so effective is the foot's unique structure. The soles contain thousands of nerve endings with minimal protective tissue. There's nowhere for the impact to disperse, so each blow sends shocking pain throughout the entire body. The pain is immediately debilitating but rarely lethal. After just a few strikes, the feet swell dramatically. Blood vessels burst, causing bruising and bleeding beneath the skin. As the beating continues, skin splits open. Recovery takes weeks or months, with some victims never regaining full use of their feet. Walking becomes excruciating, preventing escape or resistance. Still used as a punishment in some countries today, bastinado has existed for thousands of years across cultures in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. It was particularly popular in the Ottoman Empire, where it was a common punishment for minor crimes. What made bastinado practical for interrogators was that it could be repeated daily, as the feet never become numb or desensitized to the pain. Each session remains as agonizing as the first, breaking the victim's will while leaving them alive for continued questioning. If this has been rough so far, just a heads up, it's about to get even more intense. Tier 3. Iron Boot. The iron boot was a brutal device that could turn feet and legs into unrecognizable pulp. The torturer would force the victim's foot, and sometimes lower leg, into a metal boot-shaped casing. Between the leg and the metal shell, they'd insert wooden wedges or screws. As the torturer hammered in more wedges or turned the screws, the space inside would shrink, crushing the victim's foot with increasing pressure. The bones would crack one by one. First, the smaller, delicate bones of the toes and foot, then the larger bones of the ankle and shin. Victims experienced waves of agony as each bone splintered. Blood vessels burst under the pressure, causing internal bleeding that had nowhere to escape. The skin would split open as the compression continued. What made the iron boot particularly effective was how the torturer could control the pace. They might crush a single toe, then wait for the victim to consider confessing before continuing. Or they could speed up the process, creating a rapid series of breaks that would overwhelm the victim with pain. Even if someone survived this torture, they'd never walk normally again. The foot bones would heal improperly, if at all, leaving the victim permanently disabled. In medieval Europe, this was essentially a life sentence, as someone who couldn't walk could rarely work or provide for themselves. Next up is a method so depraved it barely sounds real. The Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish was a frightening metal device shaped like a closed pear. The torturer would force it into one of the victim's orifices, mouth, rectum, or any other hole, while closed. Once inserted, turning a key or screw would make the petals of the pear slowly spread open. As the device expanded, it would stretch the cavity beyond its natural limits. In the mouth, it would dislocate the jaw, crack teeth, and tear the soft tissues of the cheek and tongue. Used rectally, it caused excruciating tearing of sensitive tissues and internal damage that often led to infection. The true horror of this device was the victim's complete helplessness. Once inserted, they could do nothing to remove it or prevent its expansion. The torturer could open it just enough to cause pain without permanent damage, or continue expanding it until it caused irreparable harm. Different versions existed for different orifices, some with spikes or sharp edges that would tear flesh as the device opened. The pain was so severe that victims would often confess or provide information immediately upon seeing the device. One of the most disturbing things about the pear is how calculated it was. Designed not to just cause pain, but to violate the body's most private spaces. It's clear the goal was humiliation just as much as harm. If that seemed extreme, what's coming next takes it even further. Sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation doesn't look like torture from the outside. There's no blood, no screams, no broken bones, just people keeping someone awake. But it's one of the most effective methods ever developed for breaking human resistance. It's something I've experienced firsthand. Trying to keep this channel running on minimal sleep has been genuinely challenging. The process starts simply. Guards prevent the person from sleeping using noise, bright lights, forced standing, cold water, or simply shaking them awake whenever they drift off. For the first 24 hours, it's unpleasant but manageable. By 48 hours, the real suffering begins. The brain starts to malfunction. Victims experience hallucinations, paranoia, and intense mood swings. Their thinking becomes confused, and they lose the ability to perform even simple mental tasks. Physical symptoms follow: trembling hands, slurred speech, blurred vision, and extreme headaches. After 3 days, the immune system starts breaking down. The body's temperature regulation fails. Victims alternate between sweating and shivering. After day 4 or 5, they may experience microsleeps, seconds-long blackouts that happen without warning, sometimes with their eyes still open. What makes sleep deprivation particularly effective is that it leaves no marks while completely destroying the victim's ability to resist questioning or maintain their story. The victim becomes increasingly desperate to sleep, willing to say or do almost anything for relief. Even today, intelligence agencies and military organizations use sleep deprivation because it's difficult to prove afterward. The victim recovers their mental function once allowed to sleep, though the psychological trauma can last much longer. Falanga. Falanga, like bastinado, targets the soles of the feet, which are densely packed with nerve endings and have very little natural protection. However, while bastinado is a broader term historically used for foot beating, sometimes as judicial punishment, falanga refers specifically to a more systematic and severe form of torture. In falanga, the victim is restrained on their back with bare feet elevated. The torturer uses a rod, pipe, or cable to deliver repeated, forceful blows to the soles. The first strikes cause sharp, shooting pain, but as the beating continues, the feet swell dramatically and the pain deepens into a relentless, throbbing agony that radiates up the legs. The feet often turn purple due to internal bleeding beneath the skin, and prolonged beating can cause the skin to split, exposing raw flesh. What makes falanga especially cruel is that the feet rarely become numb. The pain from each strike remains acute. Torturers often soak the feet in cold water between sessions to reduce swelling, enabling the torture to continue day after day. The long-term effects are devastating: permanent damage to blood cells and nerves, chronic pain, and a condition known as falanga feet. Bone fractures may occur and heal improperly, causing lasting disability. Falanga remains favored by torturers partly because, unlike some other forms of torture, it leaves few visible scars once the swelling subsides, making it difficult to document in human rights investigations. It has been reported across the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia in recent decades. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull combined burning alive with psychological torture in a way few other methods have matched. I thought this one would have to do with a bull attack or something, but when I looked it up, it was so much worse. The device was a hollow bull statue made of brass or bronze, large enough to fit a person inside. The victim would be locked inside the metal chamber, and a fire lit beneath it. As the metal heated, the person inside would first feel uncomfortable warmth, then searing pain as their skin contacted the hot metal. The heat would intensify until they were essentially cooking alive. Their fat would melt and their skin would char against the metal surface. Death came from a combination of severe burns, heat stroke, and suffocation from the smoky, oxygen-depleted air inside. What made this torture truly sadistic was its acoustal design. The bull's head contained a complex system of tubes and pipes that converted the victim's screams into sounds resembling a bull's bellows. This meant that as the person died in agony, their loved ones and spectators would hear what sounded like an angry bull rather than human screams. Supposedly invented in ancient Greece by a metalworker named Perillos for the tyrant Phalaris, legends say Perillos was the first victim when Phalaris decided to test the invention on its creator. Now, for everyone's biggest nightmare turned into an actual practiced reality. Beehive torture. Beehive torture is as straightforward as it is terrifying. The victim would have their head, or sometimes their entire body, forcibly held against or inserted into an active beehive or hornet nest. Sometimes torturers would bring the nest to a restrained victim instead. The first sting would trigger a pheromone that signals other bees or hornets to attack. Within seconds, dozens or hundreds of insects would swarm, stinging repeatedly. A single bee sting hurts enough. Imagine hundreds of them targeting your face, eyes, mouth, and nose all at once. Beyond excruciating pain, the venom causes intense swelling. Victims' eyes swell shut. Their airways begin closing from stings inside their mouth and throat, and their skin blisters and burns. The sound alone, hundreds of angry insects buzzing around your head, creates overwhelming panic. What makes this method particularly brutal is that the victim can't fight back or protect themselves. Their hands are typically bound, and they can't swat away the insects or flee. Each breath risks inhaling bees, leading to internal stings that can cause fatal swelling. For most people, about 500 bee stings are lethal, but death doesn't come quickly. Victims suffer for hours as the venom works through their system, causing fever, vomiting, muscle spasms, and eventually organ failure. Even survivors face lasting trauma, potential blindness from eye stings, and sometimes permanent nervous system damage from the massive amount of venom. This next method is pure psychological destruction. Rat torture. Rat torture capitalizes on a rat's natural instinct to escape when threatened. The torturer would place a rat or several rats on the victim's body, usually the stomach or chest. A metal bucket or container would be placed over the rats, trapping them against the victim's skin. The torturer would then heat the metal container, often placing hot coals on top. As the container heats up, the rats become desperate to escape the rising temperature. With nowhere else to go, they begin clawing and gnawing through the only surface not made of hot metal, the victim's flesh. The victim experiences multiple layers of agony, the rats' claws and teeth tearing through skin and muscle, the burning heat of the container against their body, and the psychological horror of feeling creatures actively burrowing into them. The rats themselves are frantic and terrified, making them dig faster and more aggressively. What makes this method particularly cruel is its duration. It could take hours for the rats to create a hole large enough to escape through, meaning victims endured extended periods of this torture. The stomach area was chosen specifically because it contains non-vital organs, prolonging the victim's suffering without causing immediate death. Even if the torture stopped before the rats fully penetrated the abdominal cavity, victims faced severe infection from rat bites and the almost certain introduction of bacteria deep into the wounds. Sepsis and gangrene were common outcomes for survivors. Up next is a method that takes almost no physical effort from the torturer, but it's been known to break people mentally. Stick around as we dive into it. White room torture. White room torture doesn't use any physical pain, but it can break people more completely than any physical method. The victim is placed in a completely white room. White walls, white floor, white ceiling, white bed, and even white clothes. All surfaces are smooth, with no textures or patterns. The lighting is bright, constant, and also white. There's no sound, except perhaps white noise. Food is white, like rice or bread, and served on white plates. The victim has no way to tell time. No windows, no clocks, nothing that creates shadows or changes. They're isolated from human contact except for guards who don't speak to them. After a few days, the brain starts to malfunction without sensory input. The victim can't distinguish walls from floors. They lose track of time completely, unable to tell if they've been there for hours or weeks. They start to hallucinate, seeing patterns and colors that aren't there as the brain desperately tries to create stimulation. What makes this torture so effective is that it causes no physical pain, yet completely dismantles the mind. People need sensory input to maintain sanity. Without it, personality disintegration begins. Victims report feeling like they're disappearing or ceasing to exist. They become desperate for any sensory input, even pain, and will confess to anything or provide any information just to escape the nothingness. The terrifying part is how quickly it works. While physical torture victims can sometimes hold out for weeks, white room victims typically break within days, and the psychological damage can be permanent. Let's look at a method that's as creative as it is horrific. Tucker telephone. The Tucker telephone was a DIY torture device cobbled together from an old-fashioned crank telephone and electrical wiring. It got its name from the Tucker State Prison Farm in Arkansas, where it was reportedly invented in the 1960s by prison staff. The setup was simple but brutal. Guards would attach one electrical wire to the prisoner's big toe. The other wire would be wrapped around their genitals. Then, someone would crank the telephone, generating an electrical current that would surge through the victim's most sensitive body parts. The pain was excruciating and immediate. Victims described feeling like their genitals were being burned with a hot iron while simultaneously being crushed. The current caused violent muscle contractions that could throw the victim against the restraints. Some passed out from the intensity. What made this device particularly cruel was its adjustability. The torturer could apply quick, short shocks or longer, sustained currents. They could vary the intensity by how fast they cranked the phone. And unlike many torture devices that required special equipment, this could be quickly assembled from common items, then disassembled to hide the evidence. The Tucker telephone left few visible marks, making it difficult to prove its use afterward. Many victims suffered lasting damage to their reproductive and urinary systems. The psychological trauma was equally severe. Men who experienced this torture often reported sexual dysfunction and PTSD symptoms that lasted decades. Glad you're still with me, because what comes next is rough. Shuanghui, China. Shuanghui isn't officially called torture. The The Chinese Communist Party describes it as an internal discipline system for party members suspected of corruption. But for those who've experienced it tell a different story. The process begins with detention in a secret location, unknown to the victim's family or lawyers. There's no formal charge, no right to representation, and no time limit on how long someone can be held. The victim is kept in isolation, often in a small room with no bed, just a chair where they must sit for interrogation. Sleep deprivation forms the core of shuangui. Guards work in shifts to keep interrogations going for 24 hours a day, sometimes for weeks. If the victim starts to fall asleep, they're slapped, doused with cold water, or forced to stand. Some report being made to stand on bricks or uneven surfaces for days, causing excruciating leg pain and swelling. Physical beatings are common, but calculated to leave minimal visible evidence. Blows to the torso, stress positions, and squatting for hours. Many victims report being denied medication for pre-existing conditions or having food, water, and bathroom access restricted. What makes shuangui particularly effective is its combination of physical stress and psychological pressure. Interrogators tell victims that their families will suffer if they don't confess. The complete isolation and lack of legal protection creates hopelessness. Many eventually confess the crimes they didn't commit just to end the ordeal. Those who survive shuangui emerge physically broken and psychologically damaged. Many died during the process, with officials claiming heart attacks or suicides as the cause. Every level we descend, the cruelty gets more refined and more disturbing. Tier 4. Palestinian Hanging. For clarity, despite the name, this method doesn't originate from or have any specific connection to Palestine. It's simply what it has come to be called. Palestinian hanging starts by tying the victim's hands behind their back. Instead of tying them at wrist level, the torturer binds them higher up, sometimes near the shoulder blades. Then comes the worst part. The victim is suspended from the ceiling by these bound wrists, with their entire body weight pulling down their shoulders. Within minutes, the shoulders begin to dislocate. You can actually hear the pop as the ball joints tear out of their sockets. The arms get wrenched upward and backward in a completely unnatural position. The chest muscles and tendons tear from the strain. Breathing becomes difficult because the chest can't expand properly in this position. What makes this method especially cruel is how the pain gets worse over time. Blood circulation to the hands stops, causing them to swell and turn purple. The nerve damage starts quickly, with victims reporting intense burning sensations shooting down their arms, followed by numbness and tingling. Most victims pass out from the pain, but guards often wake them up with cold water or smelling salts to continue the torture. After just an hour, permanent nerve damage occurs. After several hours, the shoulder joints are destroyed beyond repair. Even after release, victims suffer lasting disability. Many lose function in their arms and hands permanently. Some develop a condition called winging scapula, where the shoulder blade sticks out from the back unnaturally. Chronic pain becomes a lifelong companion, with every movement serving as a reminder of the torture. It's hard to believe, but the next method is even more disturbing. Dry submarino. Dry submarino is a suffocation technique that creates the terror of drowning without using water. The torturer pulls a thick plastic bag over the victim's head and neck, then seals it tightly, sometimes with tape or sometimes by twisting the opening closed. As the victim breathes, they quickly use up the oxygen inside the bag. Carbon dioxide builds up rapidly. The plastic clings to their face during inhalation as they struggle to draw breath. Their lungs burn from effort. Panic sets in as the brain's primal drowning response activates. Just before the victim passes out, the torturer removes the bag. They allow a few desperate gasps of air, then repeat the process. This cycle may continue for hours. It's the anticipation that breaks people. Knowing the bag is coming back, watching it approach your face again and again. What makes dry submarino particularly effective as an interrogation technique is that it leaves almost no physical marks. Unlike beating or cutting, this method can be used repeatedly without visible evidence. Victims describe the desperation for air as the worst feeling imaginable, an instinctive, animal panic that overwhelms all thought. The technique became notorious during military dictatorships across Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s. Thousands experienced it in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. Many survivors develop lasting respiratory systems and severe PTSD, with panic attacks triggered by anything covering their face, even medical masks or scarves in cold weather. Now let's talk about one that's rarely discussed, but unforgettable. MKUltra interrogation. MKUltra was a real CIA program running from the early 1950s through the late 1960s, using unwitting American and Canadian citizens as test subjects. The program combined drugs, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and various forms of psychological abuse to break the minds and attempt mind control. A typical MKUltra interrogation started with massive doses of LSD given without the victim's knowledge. While hallucinating and disoriented, they'd be subjected to carefully scripted psychological manipulation. Recordings might play on loop for days, sometimes nonsensical phrases, sometimes the victim's own voice doctored to sound like confessions or admissions. Isolation formed a core component. Victims were kept in soundproof rooms with constant white noise or in complete silence. Some were placed in water tanks where they floated in darkness, losing all sense of their bodies and surroundings. This sensory deprivation caused hallucinations that the CIA researchers would then attempt to shape and direct. Sleep deprivation was standard, so was sexual humiliation, often recorded and threatened to be shown to family members. Some victims were given barbiturates, followed by amphetamines, creating cycles of unconsciousness and manic awareness that destroyed their sense of time and reality. What made MKUltra particularly disturbing was its scientific approach to breaking humans. Detailed records tracked which techniques worked best on different personality types. Most victims never knew they were part of the program. They were told they were receiving special therapy or participating in research for other purposes. Many suffered permanent psychological damage, with some committing suicide after their experiences. As horrifying as that was, what comes next is somehow worse. Rectal rehydration, CIA. Rectal rehydration involves forcing liquid into someone's body through their rectum using tubes and pumps. The process is humiliating and painful. The victim is typically stripped and restrained face down. A tube is forcibly inserted into their rectum, often causing tearing and bleeding. Then large amounts of fluid, sometimes plain water, sometimes containing additional substances, are pumped in rapidly. The pressure causes severe cramping and pain comparable to the worst food poisoning imaginable. Declassified CIA documents revealed they used this technique on multiple detainees during the War on Terror. In some cases, they pureed food and pumped that into detainees' rectums. One detainee's lunch tray of hummus, pasta, nuts, and raisins was liquefied and administered rectally. What makes this practice particularly cruel is its purpose: humiliation and control. Medical experts have confirmed there's no legitimate medical reason to choose this method when IV hydration is available. The psychological damage from this form of sexual assault is profound and lasting. The practice violates medical ethics and human rights standards. Victims describe feelings of extreme violation that continue long after the physical pain subsides. Many develop rectal injuries, including tears, hemorrhoids, and anal fissures that can take months to heal. Some suffer long-term problems with bowel function and chronic rectal pain. Now, if you're squeamish, this might be where you look away. Castration as punishment. Castration as punishment has been used across centuries and cultures, taking different forms with the same goal: removing a man's testicles as both physical punishment and psychological destruction. Some regimes performed surgical castration, while others used chemical methods that destroyed testicular function without surgery. The immediate physical effects are severe. Without anesthesia, the pain is excruciating. Bleeding can be profuse and life-threatening. Infection frequently follows, especially when performed in unsanitary prison conditions. Survivors experience hormonal collapse. Their bodies stop producing testosterone, leading to muscle weakness, bone density loss, and complete loss of sex drive. Nazi Germany castrated thousands of gay men, political prisoners, and others deemed deviant. The Soviet gulags under Stalin used it against political enemies. In both cases, it was part of campaigns to prevent undesirables from reproducing. What makes castration particularly cruel as punishment is its permanence and psychological impact. Victims report profound depression, identity crisis, and suicidal thoughts. The hormonal changes causes mood swings, hot flashes, and fatigue. Physical changes follow. Body hair falls out, fat redistributes to create a more feminine appearance, and the voice may change. Modern chemical castration uses drugs to suppress testosterone production, and some countries still use it for sex offenders. While technically reversible by stopping the usage of the drugs, prolonged use causes permanent changes to the body. Whether surgical or chemical, using castration as punishment deliberately attacks the core of someone's physical identity, creating suffering that continues long after other wounds have healed. You might think you've heard the worst already, but hold on. Here's one that might surprise you. Forced standing for days. Forced standing doesn't look like much from the outside. The victim just stands there. No blood, no screams, but it's one of the most physically devastating tortures ever devised. It starts simply enough. The prisoner is forced to stand in a fixed position, often with arms outstretched or against a wall. Guards ensure they never sit or lie down, using beatings or threats to keep them upright. The first few hours are just uncomfortable. By 12 hours, it becomes painful as muscles cramp and feet swell. After a day, real suffering begins. The legs and feet swell dramatically, sometimes doubling in size as fluids pool in the lower extremities. Standing becomes excruciating as joints inflame. Sleep deprivation kicks in, causing hallucinations and mental confusion. The victim might be allowed to lean slightly, but never to truly rest. By day 2, the kidneys start to fail. The continuous muscle breakdown releases proteins that poison the kidneys. Urine turns dark brown. The heart struggles to circulate blood against gravity, causing dangerous arrhythmias. The immune system begins to collapse. Many don't survive past day 3 or 4. Those who do often suffer permanent kidney damage, nerve damage in their feet and legs, and chronic circulation problems. The KGB called it Stoika and used it extensively. The CIA discovered it as one of the most effective interrogation techniques because it left no marks while causing unbearable suffering that increased with every passing hour. What's most insidious is how this torture makes the victim's own body weight become the instrument of their suffering. Can you believe something so simple can prove to be so deadly? What's the longest you've ever gone without sitting down? Let me know in the comments. Electroshock to genitals. Electroshock to genitals combines physical agony with deep psychological trauma. Unlike general electroshock, which might be applied to limbs or torso, this targets the body's most sensitive and intimate areas. The torturer attaches electrodes directly to the victim's genitals and nipples. Sometimes they use specialized devices, but often just stripped wires connected to a power source like a car battery or hand-cranked generator. The victim is typically stripped naked and restrained spread eagle to a metal bed or chair that might also be electrified. When the current flows, it causes excruciating pain unlike anything else. Victims describe it as feeling like their genitals are simultaneously being crushed, burned, and torn apart from the inside. The muscles contract violently, causing the whole body to convulse against the restraints. Many victims lose control of their bladder and bowels. The torturer can adjust the voltage and duration, sometimes using short, sharp shocks, other times letting the current run for extended periods. Water is often thrown on the victim to increase conductivity and pain. Between shocks, interrogation continues while the victim dreads the next surge of electricity. Beyond the immediate agony, this method causes lasting physical damage, nerve damage, erectile dysfunction, infertility, and chronic pain. The psychological trauma is equally severe, with many survivors reporting permanent sexual dysfunction and PTSD triggered by intimate contact. During Argentina's Dirty War, 1976 to 1983, this was standard procedure in detention centers. Similar techniques have been documented in Chile, Brazil, and numerous other regimes around the world. And if you thought that last one was extreme, this one takes it even further. Tibetan sky burial torture. Tibetan sky burial torture twists a sacred funeral practice into something horrific. In traditional Tibetan sky burials, the deceased body is cut up and left for vultures as a final act of generosity. In this torture method, victims are still alive when the process begins. The victim is taken to a remote location and tied down, usually spread eagle on their back. Their clothing removed, and sometimes incisions are made on their body to attract scavengers more quickly. Then they're simply left there, fully conscious and completely helpless. The vultures and other scavengers arrive gradually. At first, they might be cautious, picking at extremities, toes, fingers, ears. As they grow bolder, they target the softer tissues, eyes, lips, and genitals. The birds tear chunks of flesh away while the victim remains fully conscious, unable to fight back or scare them off. What makes this torture particularly horrific is its duration. Death comes slowly. The victim remains aware through much of it, feeling every tear and bite. Dehydration and exposure add to the suffering. Burning sun during the day, freezing temperatures at night. Some accounts suggest victims might live for days as they're slowly consumed. While traditional Tibetan sky burial is a respectful funeral practice, its use as torture has been reported in conflicts between Tibet and China centuries ago, though historical documentation is limited. Similar practices have been documented in other cultures, particularly leaving enemies stacked out for animals in the desert regions. The psychological terror of being eaten alive while fully conscious makes this one of the most feared execution methods in regions where it was practiced. Let's end this tier with something that you won't forget. Picana electric prod. The picana is an electric cattle prod modified specifically for torture. It looks like a metal wand or stick with electrodes at the end that delivers a high voltage, low current electrical shock. Unlike home electricity, which can stop your heart, the picana is designed to cause maximum pain without easily killing the victim. What makes the picana particularly effective for torturers is its precision. It can target extremely sensitive areas, eyelids, inside the mouth, nipples, genitals, and inside body cavities. The thin, pointed tip allows torturers to apply electricity to small, specific parts of the body that have the highest concentration of nerve endings. The pain is immediate and overwhelming, a burning, shocking sensation that causes involuntary muscle contractions. Victims describe feeling like they're being stabbed with white-hot needles that somehow reach deep inside their bodies. The electricity causes muscles to spasm violently, sometimes strong enough to dislocate joints or fracture teeth from jaw clenching. The picana became infamous during Argentina's military dictatorship 1976 to 1983, where it was the signature torture tool. Interrogators would strip victims naked, wet them down to increase conductivity, and apply the picana methodically while asking questions. They often wrapped wet cloths around parts of the body, which intensified the electrical current. What made the picana particularly cruel in Argentina was how systematically it was used. Torturers were trained in its application, learning which body parts produced the most pain without causing unconsciousness. They developed techniques like the telephone, shocks to both ears simultaneously, and the rectoscope. Survivors report lasting nerve damage, muscle weakness, and psychological trauma that includes severe reactions to any electrical devices, even household appliances. If you're hanging on, let's keep moving. This next part gets even darker. Tier 5. Coffin torture. Coffin torture traps victims in spaces barely bigger than their bodies. The coffin or box might be made of wood, metal, or even concrete, with just enough holes to prevent immediate suffocation. Some versions are built vertically, forcing victims to stand for days. Others are horizontal, keeping them lying down. At first glance, it didn't seem all that severe, maybe even deceptively harmless, but the more I looked into it, the more disturbing it became. The physical effects start immediately. You can't move more than an inch or two in any direction. Within hours, your muscles cramp painfully from the fixed position. Your joints swell. Circulation gets cut off to limbs, causing numbness followed by stabbing pins and needles pain when blood flow returns. But it's the psychological breakdown that truly defines coffin torture. Complete darkness disorients you. The silence is absolute except for your own breathing and heartbeat, which seem to get louder and louder. Many victims hallucinate or experience panic attacks. Claustrophobia develops even in people who never had it before. Bodily functions become another layer of torment. Victims often soil themselves, forced to lie in their own waste. The smell becomes overwhelming in the tiny space. Dehydration sets in quickly, causing headaches and confusion. Hunger gnaws constantly. Time loses all meaning. Hours feel like days, days like weeks. Some prisoners report counting their heartbeats just to maintain sanity. Many experience a psychological breaking point where they become convinced they've been forgotten and will die in the box. Vietnam's infamous tiger cages were a version of this torture. So were the punishment boxes used in many colonial-era prisons. Even after release, survivors often suffer PTSD and anxiety in small spaces for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, this video's not done yet. One look at this next one, and you'll wonder how humans ever invented it. Black site drowning cells. Black site drowning cells were reportedly used in secret CIA detention facilities after 9/11. Unlike traditional water torture that simulates drowning, these cells created a slow, constant threat of actual drowning that lasted for days or weeks. The cell was a small concrete room with a drain in the floor that could be closed. Guards would fill it with cold water up to the prisoner's neck or chin. The victim would be shackled to the wall, forced to stand in this position continuously. If they fell asleep or lost consciousness from exhaustion, their head would slip underwater, jolting them awake with the immediate threat of drowning. The cold water caused hypothermia within hours. Body temperature would drop dangerously low, causing uncontrollable shivering that quickly sapped strength. Muscles would cramp painfully. The skin on hands and feet would begin breaking down from constant water exposure, becoming soft, white, and eventually splitting open. Sleep deprivation compounded the torture. Victims might go a week or more without real sleep, only microsecond naps that ended in panic as they started to drown. Hallucinations were common. Some reported seeing the water level rising when it wasn't. The physical effects were devastating. Beyond hypothermia, victims developed infections from standing in dirty water, particularly if they soiled themselves. Kidney failure occurred in some cases. The constant standing caused extreme leg swelling and tissue damage. While official CIA documents never confirmed their existence, multiple detainees have described these cells independently. The psychological trauma reported by survivors includes severe water phobia and panics triggered by rainfall or being caught in the shower. What comes next is proof that the human mind can be terrifyingly inventive. Sodium thiopental confessions. Sodium thiopental isn't really a truth serum. That's Hollywood fiction, but it does lower inhibitions and make it harder to maintain complex lies. Interrogators used this reality plus the victim's belief in truth serum to create a powerful psychological weapon. The process starts with creating anticipation and agencies worldwide, including the Cold War. Psychiatric torture. The Soviet Psikhushka system turned mental hospitals into prisons for political dissidents. Unlike physical torture that ends when the session stops, psychiatric torture continued 24/7, using medical authority to convince victims they were actually insane. The process typically began with a false diagnosis. Disagreeing with Soviet ideology might be labeled sluggish schizophrenia. Religious beliefs could be called delusional disorder. Once diagnosed, victims were committed to psychiatric hospitals involuntarily, often for years. Inside, they were subjected to treatments designed to break them. Massive doses of antipsychotic drugs like haloperidol caused temporary Parkinsonism, rigid muscles, locked jaw, uncontrollable tremors, and a feeling of being trapped in your own body. These drugs also cause severe anxiety, restlessness, and an overwhelming sense of doom. Another common treatment was insulin coma therapy, injecting insulin until blood sugar dropped so low the victim fell unconscious. Before passing out, they experienced terror, confusion, and seizures. Many suffered brain damage from these repeated induced comas. What made the system particularly cruel was the complete power doctors held. Complaining about treatment was seen as a symptom of your illness. Denying you were mentally ill was proof you were mentally ill. Victims were kept isolated from family and lawyers who might help them. If they resisted, they were labeled difficult patients, requiring harsher treatments. It's difficult to fully grasp. A person is driven to psychological collapse, then institutionalized as if their condition was a crime. It reflects a deeper unsettling truth, that treatment doesn't end with the act itself, but extends into how we choose to treat its aftermath. Perhaps most devastating was how this torture attacked identity itself. Many victims began doubting their own sanity after months of being told they were ill while surrounded by actual mentally ill patients. The stigma of having been in a psychiatric institution followed them long after release, making it hard to find jobs or be taken seriously again. At this point, you've got to wonder, can something like this ever be justified? Maybe in a situation where a secret could save millions of lives? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. Forced organ harvesting, China, Falun Gong. Forced organ harvesting represents a uniquely modern form of torture where victims are killed to extract valuable body parts. Multiple human rights organizations have reported evidence of this practice targeting Chinese prisoners of conscience, particularly Falun Gong practitioners. The process allegedly begins with detailed medical testing of prisoners, blood typing, tissue matching, and organ examinations. Unlike normal prison health checks, these tests focus specifically on organ viability. Prisoners are essentially treated as living organ banks, kept healthy until their parts are needed. When a matching organ recipient is found, often a wealthy Chinese citizen or foreign transplant tourist, the prisoner is reportedly taken to a hospital or makeshift operating room. Without proper consent, surgeons remove the needed organs, kidneys, liver, heart, corneas, while the victim is either still alive or just executed. What makes this particularly horrific is that for some organs, like hearts, the victims must be alive with blood circulating when harvesting begins. Reports suggest some victims are not given enough anesthesia, potentially experiencing pain during the process. After harvesting, bodies are typically cremated immediately, destroying evidence. The scale of this practice is disputed, with Chinese officials denying it completely. However, the extreme short wait times for organs in China, days or weeks versus years in other countries, the suspicious timing of the organ transplant boom coinciding with the Falun Gong crackdown, and testimony from formal medical staff have raised serious concerns. For victims and their families, the psychological torture begins with knowing they're being kept alive potentially just for their organs. The uncertainty of when they might be selected adds another layer of terror to their imprisonment. If you thought that was the end, we're only now getting to the deepest part of this iceberg. Tier 6. Human Centipede Experiments, World War II, Japan, Unit 731. Unit 731, a Japanese military unit during World War II which doubled as a biological warfare research facility where doctors performed nightmarish experiments on live prisoners. Among the most disturbing were what veterans later described as human centipede experiments, though they weren't exactly like the horror movie. Doctors would surgically connect prisoners to each other in various configurations. Some had sections of their digestive tracts removed and attached to another prisoner to study how waste moved through modified digestive systems. Others had blood vessels redirected between bodies to see if blood types would change or if diseases would transfer. The victims, mostly Chinese civilians and POWs, remained fully conscious through many procedures. No anesthesia was used because doctors wanted to observe normal physiological responses. Prisoners were referred to as maruta, logs, to dehumanize them. The pain was unimaginable. Raw, exposed internal organs, crude stitching, and the horror of being physically attached to another suffering human. Infection was inevitable, with pus and blood seeping from connection joints. The joined prisoners couldn't move independently, often pulling at each other's surgical wounds when they tried. Most victims died within days of infection, blood loss, and organ failure. Those who survived became subjects for additional experiments, including vivisection without anesthesia to observe how their modified bodies functioned internally. After the war, most Unit 731 members never faced justice. The US government granted many immunity in exchange for their data. They returned to civilian life, some becoming prominent doctors in post-war Japan. Many took their secrets to the grave, leaving survivors with little acknowledgement of what they endured. Nerve gas testing on detainees, alleged CIA black ops. While officially denied by the CIA, reports have emerged from multiple sources about alleged nerve agent testing on detainees in black sites, secret prisons operated outside normal legal systems. Unlike wartime chemical attacks meant to kill, these tests allegedly used precise, non-lethal doses to induce extreme suffering without death. The process reportedly begins with a detainee being moved to an isolation chamber with observation windows and ventilation controls. They're typically stripped naked and restrained to prevent self-injury during convulsions. Medical monitoring equipment tracks vital signs to ensure the victim doesn't die during testing. When exposed to low-dose nerve agents like VX or sarin, the effects begin within seconds. First comes excessive drooling and sweating as the body loses control of secretions. The pupils constrict to pinpoints, causing vision problems. Breathing becomes difficult as chest muscles tighten and airways fill with fluid. Then the truly horrific symptoms start. Uncontrollable muscle spasms rack the entire body. Victims describe feeling like every muscle is being simultaneously crushed and set on fire. They vomit and lose control of bladder and bowels. The brain remains fully conscious throughout, experiencing extreme panic and pain. The testing allegedly involves exposing victims repeatedly to increasing doses, documenting recovery times between exposures. Some reports suggest combining nerve agents with psychological techniques like sleep deprivation or extreme noise to study compound effects. Long-term damage reportedly includes permanent nerve problems, muscle weakness, cognitive issues, and PTSD. The psychological trauma is particularly severe because victims experience what feels exactly like dying over and over while being kept just at the threshold of survival. I've saved the horrifying Soviet torture method for last. If there's anything these people know how to do, it's to punish their criminals. Soviet cold room, freezing interrogations. Soviet freezing torture turned winter itself into a weapon. The method was brutally simple. Strip the prisoner naked and leave them in wet clothes, then place them in an unheated cell during Russian winter when outside temperatures dropped well below zero. The cold room was typically a concrete cell with metal walls that conducted cold rather than insulating it. Often, guards would throw cold water on the floor or directly on prisoners to accelerate the freezing process. Some cells had windows deliberately left open to create wind chill. Others had metal furniture that quickly became too cold to touch, but which prisoners had to sit on during interrogations. In the first stage, the victim feels intense pain as blood vessels constrict near the skin. Violent shivering attempts to generate heat. Extremities, fingers, toes, ears, nose turn red, then blue, then white as frostbite sets in. After about 30 minutes, a deceptive warm feeling washes over the body as the brain gets confused about temperature sensing. What makes cold torture particularly effective is how it prevents clear thinking. As core temperature drops, mental function deteriorates rapidly. Decision-making becomes impaired. Speech slurs. The victim becomes confused and suggestible, perfect for interrogation. Many prisoners report agreeing to anything just to get warm. Guards would sometimes rescue victims just before permanent damage occurred, warming them up to only repeat the process the next day. This cycle of freezing and warming was more psychologically devastating than constant cold, as the body never adapted. Survivors lost fingers, toes, or ears to frostbite. Many developed chronic conditions like Raynaud's syndrome, where extremities overreact to slight cold for the rest of their lives. Thank you for watching this video, and be sure to check out my last video, The Prison Escape Iceberg.